Good morning. Good morning. I'm Ed Kelly, Dean of Gaylord College. We're pleased you could be with us here this morning as we help celebrate a very important milestone in American journalism, the 100th anniversary of the Pulitzer Prizes. The prizes were first established for work in 1916. As you know, there have been a lot of changes in reporting the news ever since, but the Pulitzers have been a gold standard that remains as coveted as ever. To commemorate the anniversary, the Pulitzer Board in New York urged news organizations and journalism programs around the country to develop ways in their local communities to prompt discussions of important issues pertinent to their locales. Here in Oklahoma, a group of top journalists and journalism educators convened last winter to take up the Pulitzer Challenge. What they decided, and was received enthusiastically by the Pulitzer Board at Columbia University, is the program you're going to see over the next 70 or 75 minutes or so, one that focuses on the issues of journalism and trauma, a familiar story to Oklahoma. Our program this morning is the second of three events here in Oklahoma related to the aforementioned issues of journalism and trauma to mark the centennial. The first event was last night at the University of Tulsa. This afternoon, the third and final event will be held at the University of Central Oklahoma in Edmond. The partners who brought you this program, as well as other events in Tulsa and Edmond, are the three universities, OU, TU, and UCO. Other important partners in the planning for and organizing the three events are the Oklahoma Press Association and the Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum. We had great sponsors, led by a major gift from the Ethics and Excellence in Journalism Foundation in Oklahoma City. Other sponsors are the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, the Lorton family in Tulsa, and several University of Tulsa entities, the Social Sciences Interest Group, the Henry Kendall College of Arts and Sciences, the Tulsa Institute of Trauma, Adversity, and Injustice, and the Department of Communication. Members of the Planning Committee I mentioned early deserve a salute too. They are Joe Height of UCO and Alana Newman of TU, who were the planning co-chairs. Also Kerry Watkins and Marianne Eckstein of the Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum. Lisa Sutliff of the Oklahoma Press Association. Mary Carver at UCO Communication, and my two colleagues here at Gaylord, Dr. David Craig, our Associate Dean, and Dr. Alani Stain, the Area Head for Journalism at Gaylord. I'd also like to recognize other people in the audience today, particularly a group of folks from Pakistan. That includes 4 colleagues visiting this semester under an exchange with the University of Gujarat, supported by the U.S. State Department. There are also Pakistani journalists visiting Gaylord College this week under another grant we at Gaylord administer with the U.S. State Department as well. Would those of you here in the room from Pakistan, would you mind either standing or waving so we could recognize you? Down here in front. Thank you all for being here. Also in the audience is Seth Prince, an OU grad who works in student media here at OU. He was a copy editor for the Oregonian News organization in Portland that received the Pulitzer Prize in Public Service in 2001 for a story about abuses by the INS. Where is Seth? Seth's over here. Thank you for being here today as well. And the aforementioned Joe Height, Joe is down here on the first row, the co-chair of the Planning Committee, was the editor of the Gazette in Colorado Springs when it received a Pulitzer Prize in 2014. Joe? I'm going to take a point of personal privilege here today to introduce the editor of my hometown newspaper, the Perry Daily Journal in North Central Oklahoma. Gloria Brown is down here on the second row. Back early in this century, she hired a young girl named Haley Branson at the age of 15 to come work for the Journal and do stories while Haley was in high school, at Perry High School. Today, Haley is up on the dais at the age of 28 as a Pulitzer Prize winner working for the Los Angeles Times. I'm so glad Gloria's here today to see Haley be honored, as well as honoring you for what you did to put her on a path to success. So again, thank you for being with us. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend Kerry Watkins, who is Executive Director of the Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum. Kerry is also an OU grad and a member of Gaylord College's Board of Visitors. Kerry?
Thank you, Ed. It's always great to be in God's country. Thanks for having us. Let me introduce a video that we did about a Pulitzer winner, Oklahoman named Anthony Shadid. And if you know Anthony, his family here, some go by Shadid. He chose to change his pronunciation to Shadid because of his Lebanese descent, and he worked many hours behind the scenes in Syria, covering the wars and the stories for Associated Press, Boston Globe, Washington Post, and finished his career at the New York Times. Anthony was a great Oklahoman and came home often and was proud of his roots here, and was frequently a guest here at the school or talking to the reporters and the journalists at the Oklahoman and other people who would want to pick his brain for his expertise and knowledge. But he was very well known for going behind the scenes and telling the human side of the story. He also pushed editors. He was known for being tough and not letting editors change his words and his phrases that he liked to use. His last article that he wrote was published, a 1,600-word article on the front page of the New York Times, a very large article of, newspapers. They struggled with how much space he wanted and how much space his articles took. But because of his humanization of the face of terrorism, he was always willing to go the extra mile, and he did that. Anthony was held in, was arrested for some of his coverage in 2011, and was held for 8 days and beaten while he was held, and physically hurt and mentally tortured. And he came home and we had a homecoming for him at the memorial in April of 2011. It was a remarkable night where people packed the audience to come hear what it was like for his time in captivity and his insight into what he had seen. And then just a year later, he would die covering stories in the same area of a kind of an allergic asthma attack. But he has a great story to share, and we captured a good portion of that while he was home visiting and telling his story about his captivity. So let me introduce to you Anthony Shadid, a Pulitzer Prize winner, a journalist who has experienced both the impact of trauma and has set a great example of courage.
Anthony Shadid always looked ahead, past the bylines and the deadlines, to a world at peace with itself. That search led him to tell the stories of ordinary people caught in conflict.
I would never call myself a war correspondent, the opposite. I actually cringe at the term. I cover conflict because it's a part of a region that I deeply care about, the Arab world. If conflict is part of that change, part of that reality of what's going on in the Arab world, then I feel like it's incumbent upon me to try to bring meaning to it.
As a foreign correspondent, his writing explains in a most human way how people are impacted by violence and terrorism. He gives a voice to people who live in the margins of history. Insight that comes only from being there on the ground, not only for the main story, but for the aftermath.
Because it's the day after that people forget about, but really that's when the tragedies come through. That's when the loss is registered. That's when the scale of what has happened is most viscerally felt.
We bear witness that if we're not there, then people aren't going to know what's happening.
What I'm always enjoy coming back to Oklahoma City or coming to the memorial here is that we understand the full impact of what terrorism really represents.
Steve Williams.
Violence can only happen in the context where people are dehumanized, where humanity is lost. For somebody to commit the crime that was committed here in Oklahoma City, people could not be seen as people.
Anthony would have firsthand experience with that in the spring of 2011 while covering the Arab Spring unrest. He and 3 other New York Times journalists were kidnapped by the Libyan military. They were blindfolded and beaten. No stranger to the hostility journalists face there, Anthony and his colleagues would be fortunate to leave North Africa with their lives.
And they finally did force us on our stomach, and I looked up at the soldier, and he said in Arabic, "Shoot them." And then again, it felt like minutes, but it was probably just a few seconds. Someone else said, "You can't, they're Americans." And they didn't.
After 6 days, they were released, Anthony returning to his family and an emotional homecoming.
It was just so moving to see how people in Oklahoma responded to this ordeal, their prayers. It's something I never expected, and when you worry about not coming home, home becomes a lot more important.
To want to do that is a matter of commitment to tell the story of something that's important in the world.
Fellow Oklahoman Mike Betcher, also a veteran international correspondent, believes Anthony's gift of communication came from a simple Oklahoma trait.
This is what was the power of Anthony Shadid, and it was rooted in the state of Oklahoma, in the sensibilities we have here, because he could talk to people. He could relate to people. Unless you can really go write the story in a way that connects with the rest of America, then it means nothing. He could do both.
Whether in the Middle East or Middle America, he identified with ordinary people, continuing to write what needed to be written, not counting the shots fired, but the lives changed.
It feels like you're doing important work. It is in the end about people, always keeping people at the center of those stories. As long as we keep that focus on that kind of shared humanity, those shared values that we have as people, I think that's in some ways the greatest antidote to terrorism and violence in general.
Thank all of you for being here. We have people in this audience who have seen a lot of trauma and report under the most difficult circumstances, and our Pakistani journalists and friends who are here, I want to celebrate you, and I want you to take part in the end when we have questions. You know, watching this, I wanted to cry, and then what made me not cry was the fact that I'm so proud to be in a room in Oklahoma at my alma mater where you can't throw a stick in here and not hit someone who's won a Pulitzer Prize who's from Oklahoma. Or has become an honorary Okie, John. I want to introduce our panelists. You see all of their bios, and you can get all the details, but I want to give more of a personal introduction to each and one of them. Hannah is the gold standard of foreign reporting. I was always amazed in Baghdad seeing you work, and all I can say is when I grow up, I want to be Hannah Allen. Magnificent work that kicked all of our butts all the time in Iraq. And she continues to do that now, continued to do it during the Arab Spring, and welcome back home to the University of Oklahoma. Haley, you know, you have students you see come through here who have great potential. Some of them live up to it, some of them don't. And if they don't, that's our fault as professors because we just didn't inspire enough. But Haley Branson Potts and her husband Mark Potts are two who did live up and are living up to their potential. And at 28 years old, a Pulitzer Prize. And so proud of you. Ed Kelly, a fellow Northern Oklahoma boy like me, who one of the best editors in the United States of America. And we're so privileged to have him here as dean. And also one of the nicest guys I know. And John Schmelzer. You know, John doesn't like to talk much about himself, but he's seen a lot over the years. Another Pulitzer Prize winner. And I had the honor of teaching with him and observing with him. And I have to tell you, in the classroom, he's the best I've ever seen. He is responsible for so many great things that come out of this college, John Schmelzer. I want to start off on a quick personal note. When I left this university in 1976, about 6 years later, I found myself in Beirut, covering the Israeli invasion of Lebanon for then a fledgling small 24-hour network called CNN that people made fun of. And after the invasion was complete and the encirclement of West Beirut was complete, word came to us at the Commodore Hotel in Beirut that there was a horrible massacre in 2 Palestinian refugee camps called Sabra and Shatila. And when I got there, to this day, it's the most horrific sight I've ever seen. The estimates of the dead range anywhere from 750 to 3,500. I can tell you it was more in the thousands. And those images stick with me. But in those days, before the internet era and the ease of use of satellite technology, when we went in there and covered that traumatic thing, and we were traumatized, and those who survived were traumatized as they saw men, women, and children with their throats slit and murdered by the thousands there. To get that material out, we had to hand it off to a taxi driver who would drive it to the Israeli border, who would then hand it off to someone who would drive to Tel Aviv and put it on the lone satellite we could use to get it out. There were 2 telexes that could be used at the Commodore Hotel. People were fighting to get on those telex machines to send their stories. Phone communication was horrible. And now if we would have covered that, and I've thought about this in this era, before we even got there, the world would know, because it would be all over social media. And our editors would already have their stories framed in their mind, what they wanted to see. Our victims and their stories would already be out there, and we're seeing this morning in the train crash in Hoboken, where the first video and images and responses to what was happening in the train crash in Hoboken, New Jersey this morning came from social media. So we're going to talk about trauma and coverage in the digital age. And Ed Kelly, I want to start with you first. You were editor of the Oklahoman in 1995, and I think that was, as you told me this morning, the last big major event of the analog era. Can you elaborate on that more and how it's changed?
Well, it really was in many ways, Mike. Really, we had a website at the time at the Oklahoman. I think the Tulsa World did as well, and there were obviously other traditional news organizations around the country that had websites, but like us, they really didn't know what to do with it. Really, the only reporting that got done on that first day of the bombing was here at OU, at the Oklahoma Daily. The Oklahoma Daily had a site, and they did some reporting off of that, off the breaking news of this big story. But so it was a different era back then. Stories weren't big stories, particularly disasters, weren't broken as they are today, as Mike said, by social media. They were broken by television, particularly cable TV, and in this case, particularly CNN. So you can imagine in Oklahoma City the swarm of television from all over the country, including lots and lots of local stations that sent their own crews and their own trucks to Oklahoma City. Newspapers, although certainly not in the breaking news business, were there to supply lots of context. It seems very quaint now, and it's really laughable, but we considered putting out what used to be called a special edition or a special section that day to get news to our readers. We decided in the middle of the day that the logistics were too much, and I'm glad we didn't do it because of because we had plenty of other things to do. But one thing that working in that era allowed us to do at the Oklahoman that day was to try to report on as thoroughly as we could the incessant rumor that was going around that the bombing had been caused by Middle Eastern terrorists. And so we pursued this with sources we had in Oklahoma City with the FBI, some other people that we knew in Washington and New York. And at the end of the day, right before our print deadlines in the evening, we decided despite what others were reporting, particularly on television, we just don't feel secure enough that we have enough information to really say that this is true. So we made kind of one passing reference to a story that was inside the paper and let it go at that. Turned out, of course, it was not the work of Middle Eastern terrorists. If that story would have happened just a year later, in 1996 rather than April 1995, I think it would have been completely different for us and everybody else who was in the fledgling days of internet or digital journalism. That there would have been a lot of pressure on us as the hometown news organization to not only report on that, but perhaps even put out a story on our website, newsok.com, that, well, this rumor is floating around, try to fuzz it up, we're not quite sure whether it is or not, but we're going to put it out there because everybody else is putting it out there. So there were advantages to being in that era, and like I said, in my opinion, it's the last big story in this country of that era, to be able to reflect during the day, do as much reporting as you can, and then decide whether or not to do anything with it.
Hannah, in 2006, you and I were in Baghdad, and that was when Twitter was born in 2006. And I kind of remember our editors back in New York saying, you got to take a look at this. It might come in handy, you might use it. It didn't really impact your coverage so much in Baghdad, but it would later on in the Arab Spring. Could you talk about that and your thoughts about how this has all changed in covering trauma in the digital age?
Sure, absolutely. Now I look back at Baghdad and I think all the times that I could have done so much more had there been social media as prevalent as it is today. So, I mean, at the time I did have a blog, and so that was where I would put things that today I would have put on Twitter or Instagram. So I go and I interview a militia leader, and his child says something funny, or his wife comes and shows him up, or some funny aside or something insightful, or that takes you right there to the place that might not have a place to, you can put it in your story, but it shows you something about where you are and what's happening in the war. Funny remarks of troops, for example, or that really actually got to issues of morale, for example, and PTSD, and all those sorts of things that now we talk about widely on social media. So I look back and I think, oh, if only I had had that. So all of that changed in the Arab Spring, where I was bureau chief in Cairo, and I had sort of 6 simultaneous revolts happening. And so I'm trying to cover Yemen and Bahrain and Syria and Libya and Tunisia and Egypt, where I lived, with a newborn. And so it was a pretty crazy time. And so a lot of what I could do during the day, when the government didn't completely shut down internet for a while, is I would just constantly update what I'm seeing. We're being attacked with tear gas here. And it was also very important, apart from reporting, as a safety mechanism. Don't go on this bridge, they're waiting, they can ambush you, don't go over here, watch out, there's pro-regime march coming down this street. And so on a number of ways, it was so much more helpful to coverage, to safety. And in Baghdad, I mean, I just wish we'd had that, and I think we could have been a lot smarter. We did have and do have closed Facebook chat groups that kind of tell you that sort of thing, but the real-time feed of Twitter is great. There are downsides too, though, and I think that pressure to be first is so much more intense, and you see people, on Instagram that I feel sometimes, do you need to be that close to the ISIS flag, or are you doing that to have the cool black flag in the in the picture to show you're right there on the front line? And sometimes I think it can lead to recklessness. I think there are also ethical issues when you're at a scene like Sabra Shatila. I've seen that scene in Baghdad when there was a terrible stampede where 1,000 bodies are laid out in front of me. And if I'd snapped away, I mean, that raises ethical issues as well. Like, do we just publish? We certainly can't do that for troops, for U.S. forces when we're embedded because of rules. So then it gets into this, sort of squirrely debate over all of that. So I think it's overall net positive. It's helped my work in so many ways. It's a repository for all the cool little anecdotes I can't get into my stories. It adds the color and takes people there viscerally in a way that they will never just from reading. But I think we have to also unplug, think, take a break from it, because I don't know about you, but my Twitter feed can be, sometimes it's just a steady stream of bad stuff, sort of humans behaving badly all over the world. And it takes a toll on you.
Absolutely. Haley, you are a product, grew up in the digital age, in the age of social media, and looking at the Los Angeles Times submissions to the Pulitzer Committee, you follow all of the social media. I mean, you tweeting out, police cars racing to the scene. And tell us how that impacted your coverage and what the pressure was like that social media presented in covering this and eventually winning a Pulitzer.
Sure. We actually learned the news on Twitter. This was December 2nd, and this had the difference of being here. This was in our city. It's not a place where you expect something like this to happen. We were a week removed to the day from losing 20% of our newsroom to buyouts. So we had all come back. We had lost about 80 to 90 reporters. So we had all come back to work. This is the week after Thanksgiving. And, it was kind of mid-morning. We were all feeling sorry for ourselves. And somebody saw a really vague tweet from San Bernardino that said up to 20 dead. And as soon as that tweet went out, we hadn't even determined what had gone on. We were in the car. Myself and a couple other people. It's 60 miles east. So LA traffic, it can be anywhere from an hour to 3. So we raced there, and they had the city locked down really quickly. With social media, we just had to move so fast. Within the first hour, even before I and the other reporters got to the scene, our team in the newsroom had more than a dozen posts saying, people are hiding in buildings. This is what we know so far. Police are looking for the shooters. They didn't know what's going on. And the San Bernardino Fire Department, again, while we're driving out there, they put out an official tweet that said live updates on today's events can be found on the LA Times website. So there was that pressure from this official agency saying, turn to them. They've got the information. And so by the time we got there, it's chaotic. People are coming out of the building. They had just started letting people out of it. I started tweeting, and the other people started tweeting. And we were spread out. It's a big spread out city, and I tweeted out some video of where the chase started. Because there were all these false rumors. There were 2 shooters. People said there were 3. There were people. Just mass confusion. Anytime you have a disaster like this, there was. And so anything we put out, it was basically publishing on the spot. We had to be so careful not to go with rumors. We had to verify everything. Everything I tweeted out, I knew, this better be right because it's getting retweeted. People were following this. We had to know the hashtags while we're on the field talking to victims. So it was, people followed it so closely. And so that really, part of our entry for the Pulitzer entry was the live blog, which was largely our tweets from the field. And so while we were doing this, you just have to keep in mind, while you're right there, okay, I can't, in between these things, be tweeting about, my birthday or something personal. You just have to be so cognizant of what you're doing and know that everyone's watching this. And you just had to turn things around so quickly. We within the shooting was shortly before noon. By 11 p.m., not counting the dozens of other stories, our main story on the website was updated 22 times. So that's just the amount of publishing we did instantly.
Thank you. Very insightful. John, and I know one of the first panels you were on ever that you did in your career was the impact of trauma on the emerging technology of radio. And it's supposed to be funny, guys.
Radio, you know what radio is?
Man, wake up, folks. John, you've seen a lot of things and trauma, and you know, your coverage of the aviation industry, which won you a Pulitzer. I mean, you've seen horrific plane crash scenes, and working as a reporter, then editor during that era, and now as an instructor of young journalists coming up. Are there some of the same tools we still carry with us, despite what social media and other technology we have has impacted?
Some of the same tools are there that we're using, but we're using a lot newer tools. This device is becoming the standard, and we are now teaching students more and more that this should be their go-to device for not only for providing videos and pictures, but also for storytelling, because they can go and take notes, they can go and do their stories, they can go and put it on Instagram, they can tweet it out. There's so many ways you can use this device to go and help with your storytelling. And we're, you know, I think back to Melissa Foy, and she graduated in 2011,
I think so, yeah.
2012. And it was when Mike and I were doing a project called Afghan 101. Mike was deployed to Afghanistan with the 101st Airborne, and we were traveling back and forth to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, 7 rotten times in a university van, going back and forth with students to Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Well, one of the times when we went, I think it was the second trip, Melissa had gone with this group, and we had another woman with us from a photographer whose father was a war photographer in Eastern Europe, and she was an exchange student. And we got there, and we're sitting there talking to the rear guard captain. The rear guard captain is someone that stays back at the base and, you know, is in charge of the base while the unit is deployed to, in this case, Afghanistan. Anyway, and he mentioned that there was a garage sale going on the base that day, and it was like, well, so what? And I thought, and Melissa followed up on that and asked what kind of garage sale it was. Oh, it's a garage sale for a woman whose husband was killed 2 months ago. Well, Melissa asked the women that were there, who had come to go and work with our students, asked if she could go to the garage sale and think, well, she thought I could go and at least go and talk to this woman. And we were doing stories about the impact upon the families. 9 hours later, Melissa came back to the hotel. The woman had never been out of the house since the funeral at Arlington National Cemetery. Because of Melissa and this other student that were there, she decided she felt comfortable enough to go out of the house for the first time that night. They went to a concert, and I had to deal with Melissa and a van load of women and men who were crying the entire day coming back because the story was so traumatic to them. So you go and we put students in places that you don't expect there to be trauma, and it turns out you have tremendous trauma. You go and put people and do things that you don't expect, and you get prepared, but you're not prepared. You have to think your way through it. When I got asked to do this, and I started doing it this morning again, and I didn't want to remember a lot of things that I've covered. I don't want to go see the 9/11 museum. I'm sorry. I covered 9/11. over 1,000 souls have died, more than 1,000 souls have died in plane crashes that I've covered, and I've covered in person. I don't like to remember that stuff. And I started remembering that today. So this is a difficult thing for journalists. It's going to become more difficult because of this. Police and fire and officials have always kept us at bay. This device, this phone, is going to allow us to walk into places where we've never walked into places. It's always been the photographers who are the ones that have been the ones that are taking it in the chops, not the reporters. Now it's the reporters and the photographers. And the issue that we have to face as journalists is to realize that we have to go and deal with this trauma, think about what we're doing, and think about how we can do it in a more safe manner, both to ourselves personally and to the people around us.
Hannah, I saw you watching intently and shaking your head sometimes when John was speaking. What were you thinking? How do you react to what John just said?
I was thinking that yes, I do agree it can be a lot to take in and to keep doing year after year. And I was actually thinking about our Pakistani colleagues here and how, it always felt sort of unfair that because of my magical blue passport, I could leave Baghdad. I could do 6 weeks on, 2 weeks off, and I would think of my Iraqi colleagues where I would say, bye, see you in 2 weeks, and they're still there every day. And how another benefit of social media is that those who are closest to the story, local journalists, there's pluses and minuses. The plus is that they have a voice that before it was sort of the Western foreign correspondent coming in, saying, go and interview all these people, you take up their interviews and you write it up, and if you're nice and generous, you give a co-byline. But a lot of times, all of those contributions were not recognized, and that's been a big change. And now, even if they're working as quote-unquote fixers, with Western reporters, I really do like the fact that they now have their own Twitter accounts and their own Instagram accounts. And so I think that's really important. And also there are more programs in place now to keep them safe. I remember, instances of working with local reporters where maybe we had one flak vest, one Kevlar vest, and it's me and a translator and a driver and maybe a bodyguard or something. I'm not going to put that on and my colleagues don't have it. And so, I think that's where bureau chiefs need to be insistent on everyone being protected. And if we are going to go do this, and if we are going to see these scenes day after day, everyone on the team needs to have the same level of protection, both in country, but also you have to check up on people afterwards. Look at the suicide rate for soldiers, 20 a day. Because they had this mass mobilization, mass deployment, and we're seeing this impact. A lot of those same issues are journalists deal with as well. And I remember going to a Dart Center retreat one time and someone saying, journalists are the only first responders that don't have that sort of care. And I started thinking about, am I a first responder? Yeah, often I am. I'm the first one on the scene, not in the terms of giving medical aid, but absolutely, you're right there. You see these things, and you have to take care of yourself and others. And so yes, I agree with that. But I also wouldn't discount the positives. When I had made some notes on how sort of helped and hurt, and how the ability to reach younger readers. And viewers through Instagram and Twitter can't be overstated. They are not subscribing to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, one of our papers, but they do follow me on Twitter. And I have a different voice on Twitter and on Instagram than I have in my stories, where I have to be all, and then on Twitter, I'm like, it goes down in the DMs. And it's, and I mean that in the sense of, I also, it literally goes down in the DMs, and that's a song, but there's, it's the direct messages. And I have sources who can't approach me on the street, can't approach me at State Department, can't come to my office, so we do encrypted chats, we do Telegram, or they DM me. And so I get a lot of sources that way too. So, I mean, I really weigh the positives and negatives. And the last thing is activist journalists, so where I was saying it was helpful for local journalists, it can also really compromise the integrity of the reporting if we have all these unfiltered reports coming out of San Bernardino. I saw it after Charlotte, just recently, after Freddie Gray in Baltimore, and people are on the scene, and sometimes it looks like there's been a shooting, it looks like there's been a killing, but we don't know the facts yet. And so, but people on the ground who don't have the same restrictions on publication that we do will put it out there, and they will get their retweets. And then, you know, it just snowballs, and then instead of gathering your own news and building from the ground up, you're trying to, you know, verify these wild rumors. And so that's been a big issue for Syria, which is a black hole for reporting, where we rely so much on activists. And we honestly, if somebody said, what's the death toll? I don't think we have a clear handle on the death toll. I don't think we know the full picture there, because we're so reliant on non-journalists to go in. And I mean, pictures, yes, there's photos that come out of there, and they're invaluable to showing the suffering in, say, Aleppo or somewhere. But it's bigger than that. And so I don't know. I think we're all still wrestling with how do we incorporate the activist journalism and citizen journalism with our journalism, reported journalism, and the accounts of locals who will know the place and the history and the sensibilities better than any of us who parachute in, but also you have a dog in the fight, maybe, you know. So it's really, these are all issues that I'm glad we're talking about today.
Haley, you grew up with that, in that generation, with that digital voice, if you might. You heard what Hannah had to say. Do you think we've lost our role as gatekeepers at all? That social media, for example, so outruns us at the beginning that even if we try to sort out, let's say, for example, what Ed was talking about with Oklahoma City and blaming it first on a Muslim conspiracy, which it wasn't. And now you're being bombarded in San Bernardino with all of this stuff in the climate we live in now, and trying to gatekeep, but also trying to stay ahead. I mean, that has to be immense pressure. And does that role as a gatekeeper still even exist, do you think?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's more important now because of that. And it's been challenging because of all of those, you know, especially with a major disaster story. False news comes out so quickly that there has to be that trusted source, that there are those barriers. They're not going to publish it until they get it right. I mean, even with the Moore tornado in 2013, the initial reports were that 90 people were dead. I believe it was the medical examiner double counted or something like that. And that was up all day long. And it took our organizations communicating with officials to get that correct, because it's such chaos in the beginning. But it also creates, not just for the journalists, it creates major pressures for the people who happen to find themselves involved in these stories, because with San Bernardino, one of the first victim names to come out, and it came out through social media, it was family talking about this person on his Facebook page, was a man named Nicholas Thalassinos, 52-year-old county health worker, very active on Facebook and on social media. And so once the names come out, that's the first thing reporters do, is turn to their public profiles. You start to gather this impression of who is this person. You do it with criminals, you do it with victims. It's just a natural, okay, here's this information. And Nicholas was, he had a Facebook page that was just full of incendiary things. He had very strong views. He got kicked off Facebook several times, and he called it Facebook jail. he created a second account to use his Facebook page when he was kicked out and on Facebook jail. And so when his name came out, people turned to his Facebook page. And within probably an hour of that coming out, there was a New York Daily News headline. There was a columnist that had already done a think piece, and the headline was, "San Bernardino killers were radical, ISIS-loving monsters, but one of their victims was just as bigoted." And this is somebody who had just died, not 24 hours before. His family had just found out. And that got out there really quickly. And people were using screenshots of his Facebook page and screenshots of his tweets. And everyone had formed this opinion about him. And so I went to his widow's house, and she happens to pull up. And you kind of just feel it's a strange position to be knocking on doors and, hey, tell me about your husband who just died. And there were TV cameras. We were all waiting at the house, and she pulled up, and, she's not had a day to process this. And, she was saying, he's very, proudly conservative, religious. He was what's called a Messianic Jew, which is Jewish people who believe in Jesus. And he wore, seats, and he wore prayer cap and Star of David, and would often get in fights with the person who was his colleague who ended up being the killer. And she's saying, in this interview, still having not processed this, saying, I wouldn't be surprised if he picked a fight with Syed. I wouldn't be surprised if, he got mad because of this. And she's just processing. And this goes live on TV really quickly. And just the speed of these things. And so I did my questions with her as well, and they said, you have to be so careful. I didn't want to pick out pieces of what she said and tweet them out, because she's saying, oh, he's a martyr. And so we went back and talked with her and talked with their pastors and did a more nuanced story about how, this image of him was created so quickly because of social media and because of his social media, and he's a victim. So it leads for a lot of good things in reporting, but it can also really lead to harm. He was not a public figure. He didn't think his Facebook page would be splashed across, international news outlets. So it was really complicated.
Hannah, do you think that we as journalists have an obligation, and should it take up part of our time to set the record straight that sometimes that conventional wisdom is false because of how it was portrayed on social media and things that come out, instead of going out and doing what we normally do, going out, talking to people, finding out ourselves? Over here on the other side, everyone's seeing something else coming out. Did you find yourself in the Arab Spring, for example, trying to set the record straight, exerting energy to do that?
Sure, and even more recently, even in after some of the protests in Charlotte and Baltimore, and after, I cover national security as well, and so it's even after the Orlando shooting, and where there were all these wild rumors, and just sometimes I think a worthwhile piece is to just step back and say, everything we knew about this case was wrong. And every time one of these mass casualty events occurs, one of these, really deadly incidents, I think of a couple of things. I think of this journalist that I love, The Guardian, Spencer Ackerman. He says, just remember that one fact uncovered is better than 1,000 hot takes.
Mm-hmm.
Just work on uncovering the facts. And the second is the first reports on one of these are almost always wrong. And so every time one of these happens, I retweet that. I just re-up that. Like, hey, everybody, let's remember, because there's often not 2 or 3 shooters, it's 1. There's not 90 victims, there are 3. It's so yes, I think, but that's adding an extra role. You're there, you're trying to get your own story, and you're trying to do something, and you're sort of policing everything that's out there, and it can be difficult.
Well, and I think it's led to less. I was seeing reports after the after Orlando. I was in Los Angeles at the time, and there was the Pride Parade was that day, and we got very early reports that somebody was driving to that parade with a lot of ammunition. So I was there, and the number that morning kept changing. Because that's even the police investigation. Social media is even faster than the police who were on the scene giving us the information. And all morning they had said something like maybe 20 dead, and then it rose to 50, and then 49. And one of the first posts I saw on Facebook, someone I went to school with said, the reports keep changing. This is just the media trying to get us to feel that this is worse than it is. And I think that's led to a lot of distrust from people when they see stuff that go out immediately, and they say, well, it's the media trying to change the story, and you're just moving.
It has an impact, and here's an Oklahoma, a real-life impact. I was a senior in high school at U.S. Grant, Southside Oklahoma City, when the Oklahoma City bombing happened, and I felt it. We felt it. It was Coach Knight's English class, and it was so loud we thought that it was in the science lab. We're like, oh, what are they? We were joking about it, and then the news came over the loudspeaker, and then we were herded to an auditorium, and then we watched the TV, and then we watched the John Doe number 1 and John Doe number 2 suspects come out, dark, Middle Eastern, everything, and I'm there grieving with everybody else, and suddenly a kid says, Hannah's dad is John Doe number 2. And then it became this thing, Hannah's dad is John Doe number 2. And it was really painful, and I'm reminded of that. Like, it's important that we get this stuff right, There are personal consequences, and lives can be ruined. I mean, look at the Atlanta bombing, I think, the Olympic bombing. That was a case where somebody, I think, won a lawsuit over being named so many times because of Reddit and sort of dark internet and all of that, where a lot of these names come up before they're in sort of mainstream media.
And the Dallas shooting.
The Dallas.
They had that poor man's picture up on TV.
Oh, yeah, right. And he had he was licensed to carry and was exercising his Second Amendment rights. Oh, but he was black. So, and that was a big ethical fail, I think.
One of the problems that we also face is managing the expectations of our editors. Our editors are drawing their earliest conclusions from what is moving on social media, and the reporters and photographers on the scene are having to push back on their editors and say, give us time, you're wrong, let us go and figure this out. And some of the better papers will step back, some of the worst, some of the not so good papers, the editors, it's a top-down management style, and unfortunately, the reporters are chasing the story that the editor assigns, and it's our job to push back and go and say, no, we're not going to do that story because it's not correct.
I want to open this up for questions for about 15, 20 minutes. Do we have any questions from the audience? And I'll come up to you with the mic. Yes, sir. Hold on. Let me come to you.
You just commented on reporters holding their editors accountable. What do you think about things like native advertising, where basically where newspapers and online magazines and such, like they get so crowded with advertisements and things like that, and so much information, like you said, goes out that's incorrect. How would one, as a reporter, hold their editor accountable and say, we can't do this story until we know for a fact that all these things are correct?
As you were asking the question, I was thinking about an ad that ran in the Chicago Tribune, and I'm desperately trying to remember who it was that placed the ad, and I can't remember, but it was a picture of a building on North Michigan Avenue, and I want to say it was Google, and they had the stupid building on the wrong side of the street because they were using a Google algorithm to go and get the picture. And the editorial department stepped in and hammered the story, hammered the ad saying it was wrong. The advertising department, the Tribune, said we were costing them millions of dollars in trying to stop us from doing the story. It ended up with the advertiser redoing, rerunning the ad with the building on the correct side of the street. So yeah, we have an obligation to go and push back and hold the advertisers accountable, just as we go and hold citizens accountable.
Thank you. We have a question here.
Hi. First of all, thank you guys all for joining us today. I do have a question. You spoke a little bit about social media and its impact on trauma coverage. I wanted to know more about what you guys think. Is social media kind of dehumanizing? It's the reality of what's happening in these situations. I know a little while back there was the picture of the Aleppo boy, the very famous photo of the Aleppo boy, and how much attention that brought to the situation in Syria. I just wanted to know what you guys thought about social media and its effects. Is it dehumanizing, or is it, the attention we need?
Well, this is something that is, this is a very current struggle that I have right now, and I go back and forth because we're talking about the Black Lives Matter protests, we're talking about refugees, and I see the arguments. I see, very powerful arguments that, Emmett Till's mother wanted an open casket to show the world what this ugliness looked like, and that galvanized communities. And so but at the same time, are we deadening ourselves, numbing ourselves when it's a steady stream of this, and if nothing changes? So I see the other argument where it's the fetishization of, it's like a pornography of violence, and to what end? To see broken and bruised and dead black, brown, whatever bodies from all over the world. Alan Kurdi, the little Syrian boy, the sad part is he's not an anomaly. That happens daily. Kids wash up daily on those shores. And while it was, I think, a profound moment that we all had a gut check, like, yeah, this is still happening, we were also happy to move right along. And so is it useful? Is it just sort of a prick at our collective conscience now and then, but nothing really changes? I think, it's a hard one, because traditionally I have been all for marketplace of ideas. You put it out there. I grew up partly in the Middle East, where everything is out there, and the reality is something that we live with every day: bombings, occupation. All these ills that people deal with, and I think that's important to document, but I think that we should also not have that be the sole lens that we look upon any one community.
Hi, thank you. You mentioned earlier that you tweet a lot, and that you tweet a lot, that you reach out to younger audiences, because younger audiences aren't necessarily subscribing to newspapers. And it got me wondering about the commercial aspects of the business we are all in. We can't make news if we're not getting paid, and we're not getting paid if ads aren't being sold. When you're out there on the fly, posting or tweeting or Instagramming, do you keep any space in your mind for trying to get them to direct them to the website, to get traffic across those sites? How much time do you spend? I know you mentioned you were doing it really, really fast. Do you think about that when you're doing that? Does the commercial aspect of what you're trying to do enter into your equations?
For me personally, it's not so much a commercial aspect. Obviously it helps. I can pull up the LA Times website as an employee at any time and see exactly how many people are on the site at all times. We've all got numbers in our head, and unfortunately it drives a lot more than it should. But with breaking news, I try as much as I can to also tweet links to stories with my tweets, not so much for the commercial side, but just so people have that greater context than 140 characters. And we have a great social media team that knows which reporters are on the field, and they'll use the official newspaper's account to tweet my stuff, which again is more got to be cognizant of what I'm putting out there. But for me, it's more about just drawing people to the larger story than the commercial side of it. But the numbers definitely are on our minds all the time.
We live and die by the click now, and that's just the reality of it. And so, I mean, you asked me 2 years ago, I would have never retweeted one of my stories or anything anybody said about my stories. I still don't do that. Like, the artine compliments is still way too icky for me. But even, you know, because that's not why you get into it. That's not why you just want to do good work. And now it's like you have to do good work and say, look at my good work. and it's something weird about that. And I'm not completely comfortable with it, although I'm trying to take a page from my younger colleagues who, you know, tweet out all their stories. And yeah, the self-promotion, because you have to. I mean, that's just, you know, if you want to stay in the game, you have to do at least some of that.
With the increased politicization of the media and the perception of the media, how do you guys personally combat the kind of like the difference between your print media and your entertainment-based, ratings-based media, and their almost immediate reaction to rush to judgment and throw out all these hypotheticals, and when you're trying to conduct, I guess, legitimize like reports on what's actually happening? How do you combat that urge to, you know, the back and forth? I'm sorry.
It's hard. I mean, I you know, my husband will laugh at me with how much I guard all of my social accounts, even Facebook. I've got that locked down. That's personal. Nobody can see that unless they're a family or friend. I don't put any opinions out there on anything. And it's really, really challenging, and I don't know the answer to that, because when people refer to the media, you know, capital T, capital M, people don't see the differences. You know, we're not out there analyzing. We're not out there, you know, four-screen faces. And so I think it's our job, I guess, to explain that. You know, I don't know where our editorial writers sit. And I admire that about our newspaper. We keep that steady wall between the two. But it's more challenging, especially with social media. And we've had several emails from our high-up editors during this campaign to the entire staff that says, do not comment on the election. You know, if you don't write about politics, don't weigh in. And that's hard because people want to. That's, you know, it's really tempting, but it's getting harder.
May I just add one thing on that? I used to have a real problem with that too, like where it's the, you know, entertainment seeping into, you know, the infotainment sort of movement. And I've come around a little bit on that because of, I think, BuzzFeed and Facebook. And it was something that I heard, maybe it was you know, an exec at Facebook or somewhere, maybe it was BuzzFeed, who basically described this sort of cafe model where if I'm at a cafe in Paris and I'm reading the newspaper and I'm reading about a terrible bombing, and then I look over and say, oh, that's a cute kid. And then I go back and then I read about this election and in Egypt, and then I look up and it's like, oh, nice day. Oh, I like that song that's on. Like, that is, if you look at that, that's sort of what our Facebook feed is like. You know, it's cute kid, animals, somebody's video, oh God, you know, refugees. You know, it's really like, it's like that. And so I think that now our brains are conditioned to, you know, process that information like that. It's still a worrisome sort of blend for me, but I think that people are kind of coming around to the fact that one news source can sort of have all of those different elements.
Good question is that.
I've recently become obsessed with the idea that objectivity doesn't hold up anymore in journalism, and my idea behind that is because the media that I see shared on social media by people who aren't in the media is normally on the right or it's on the left, and it tends to be backing up an idea that they already had. And anything that is seen with objectivity, like places like the Washington Post or the New York Times that actually do good work, they're all immediately labeled the liberal media. So, and it relates to the last question a little bit, but what do you guys think about that pillar of journalism, of objectivity, of being this omniscient thing that's just telling the facts, And I think that whether or not it's hurting journalism and going away, and if we need to find something else to kind of be our pillar rather than objectivity.
Objectivity, and it's has been around, or the issue of objectivity and the journalist's role in it has been around forever and ever and ever. Let's say, for example, that you're assigned to go cover a murder trial at the Cleveland County Courthouse. Well, you and your editor talk about how long you're going to stay. Okay, that's a subjective decision. You're not going to stay maybe all day if the trial lasts 9 hours, but you're only going to stay 3. You and your editor have already made a subjective decision how long you're going to be there. Then there's going to be space constraints, either because of time, digitally, or in print because of space. That's another subjective decision that you've already made. And then you're sitting in the courthouse, you're taking notes, you're observing, trying to be more than just a stenographer, but being a true journalist on what's important. Well, those decisions that you're making, either consciously or subconsciously, those are subjective decisions as well. So the issue of the idea of objectivity has always been one that all of us as journalists have strived for, knowing, of course, that really it is impossible. But I think both Haley and Hannah have described the sort of the real world of journalism that they work in every day these days, of particularly on these giant calamities and disasters, these huge news stories, where those first few minutes, or in some cases those first few hours, where it truly is a free-for-all. It's a scrum. You have people out there who are not journalists but are tweeting and screaming over their social media that this is going on and that's going on, and where is the lamestream media? How come they're not reporting all this? Because we're seeing it with our own eyes. Well, I'll give you an example that's not a disaster, but this past winter, late on a Saturday afternoon, it was reported, again on social media, that Antonin Scalia, the Associate Justice, had died in Texas. Obviously a huge story in this country. The New York Times was about an hour or so later before they tweeted out that and it confirmed that Justice Scalia had indeed died. Well, there was criticism among Times readers, and Times readers are some of the most devoted consumers of journalism in this country, about, well, where was the New York Times? I was out and about, and I was seeing my social media feed blow up that Antonin Scalia died, and I kept looking for, well, where's the New York Times? And in talking to one of my friends who works at the Times, their reaction was basically, if we're wrong, how do you walk back the death of a Supreme Court justice? How do you walk that back if you're the New York Times? It's one thing if you're somebody else, a private citizen, or working for something that may be more of an entertainment-based site than what we would all describe as a news site. But when you're a responsible organization like what Haley and Hannah work for, and like what John worked for many years at the Tribune in Chicago, how do you take back something of that magnitude?
We reported on the front page that the alderman of the 1st Ward had died at 10 p.m. that night. The next morning, the first city editor on the desk, gets a phone call from the 1st Ward alderman saying, I'm very much alive. Try to walk that baby back.
Before we wrap this up, Hannah and Haley, I'd like you to introduce your family members who are here, and that will lead to my final question. And he's taking a nap.
I know,
So don't wake him up.
I hope this was more exciting for everyone else because my son is asleep in the second row. But yes, my mother is here, Beverly, and my son Bilal. And, one of the things that I've learned in trauma journalism retreats is that no matter how hard it is on those who are out doing it, we have the excitement and the adrenaline and the story and the instant gratification and this being witness to this momentous occasion, and that it's always harder for the folks back home who don't have that. They have the fear and the concern. So before I get into the ugly cry, I just want to say thank you, Mom, for everything.
My dad, Jason Branson, is here today. He's my taxi cab for the weekend. And my honorary grandma, Gloria, is sitting right next to him. She hired me when I was 15. And to your point about that, when I was in San Bernardino, my mom texted me
said, "You're not there, are you?" And I sent her a picture of an armored police car going by. And she responded with a picture of her hand that said, "I'm going to slap you when you get home." Because I couldn't answer any more texts. I was watching these police go by. So it's, it's definitely appreciated to have supportive family at home.
And that leads me to the final question. You've already really posed it, and we're going to deal more with this at UCO in the afternoon. But personally, with you and your families and witnessing trauma, and when you had time to decompress after San Bernardino and all of that, are you different? How are you different than when you left Oklahoma and made that brave step overseas? And how are you different when you left Oklahoma and went to Los Angeles and covered these things?
Yes, it's now, things that seemed to be really big deals, you just kind of let stuff slide. And it's much harder to, I don't get angry about the same kinds of things. But at the same time, I try not to be, self-righteous when my friends are like, I don't like this dress. And I'm like, do you know people are dying in Syria? I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be the party pooper. But at the same time, yes, I think that there is, one of the most transformational things I learned about covering trauma came from Alana Newman right here from Tulsa. Incredible. I saw when I was at Harvard as a Neiman Fellow, she came. She didn't remember me, that's okay. But she came and presented and showed two, I remember brain scans, and it was sort of like, this is your brain on trauma, as if I'm way oversimplifying your years of research. But it was absolutely transformational for me to understand that it wasn't about, you're too weak to do this, you don't have what it takes, there's actual physiological effects on your brain when you do this. So take care of yourselves if you do this. And so I've learned that absolutely you have to take breaks, you have to unplug, and also to be more cognizant of those around you when they're having a hard time, because sometimes if we're out in the field and our editors at home don't see that someone's really breaking down, that we should actually serve as that support network. So I hope that that's the kind of work that I can do now and how I've changed.
I would definitely agree with all that. I too have learned how to take care of myself. And I'm a Metro reporter, so I don't cover the kinds of trauma that you do, but I've seen people's bodies after they've been shot, and I've seen a kid get run over, and all kinds of local trauma. And when I covered the tornado here in Oklahoma City, or in Moore, I saw the little girl in her casket and her sister, her 10-year-old sister next to her saying, "Oh, I was so mean to you." After something like that, I've learned to actually, if I'm going to see someone later that day, actually say, I just need to be alone. Because it's really strange when it's, I'm at work, I'm seeing this dead kid on the road, and his grandparents come and pick his backpack up after they've cleaned the body up, and someone calling and saying, "Hey, let's go to dinner." So I've kind of learned to, okay, no, I need this time for myself. And like you said, it's hard to not be that callous person, because we had an event last weekend where my husband had a movie screening in Los Angeles. It was really exciting, and somebody got hit right outside the theater. Somebody going 45 miles an hour hit this guy who was between the crosswalks. And he was really, we went up and talked to the officer, and he said, well, he's in bad shape, but he's going to make it. He's alive. And so in my mind, it's like, okay, he's fine. The screening was great, and my husband is just really shaken up. So it's hard. You have to kind of recognize, we're a little more callous than we should be, and to kind of pay attention to how other people are feeling about things.
Yeah, my editor used to say, when you stop, I remember a scene in Lebanon where I called him and I could barely even dictate over the phone because I was just gasping and crying, and it was just a lot of dead children from an Israeli airstrike. And I said, I'm so sorry, Mark, I'm so sorry, I'm trying. And he said, look, the day that doesn't bother you is the day you need to come home. So that's sort of my maximum.
Well, Go ahead.
No,
No, please, that's it. He's the dean.
I wanted to.
No, after you.
But he doesn't sign the check.
No. Both Hannah and Mike have mentioned our friends from Pakistan down here, and I'm going to tell you a personal story. We here at Gaylord College have the benefit of bringing these folks here on these grants that we administer with the United States State Department. They spend time in Norman, then they spend time in St. Louis, and then they spend a few days in Washington, D.C. I've had the opportunity over the last year to accompany two of these groups when they go to Washington, D.C. And one of the places that I like to take them is the Museum of News. I hope all of you had a chance to go to Washington and see it. If you haven't, you really need to do it if you love the news like we do. And on the third floor of the museum is a place that's simply called the Journalists' Memorial. It's on the west side of the building. And I like to take these Pakistanis up there because what you have in that memorial is basically glass walls with names of journalists from around the world, not just U.S.-based journalists or Western-based, but from around the world that have died reporting in a post-9/11 world, basically since 2001. There are all these names by year and the country where all these men and women lived, as well as another wall with photos of all of these people. It's very humbling to see these fellow journalists from Pakistan. When I take them up to the third floor, they immediately go to the walls and then they start talking to me about, yeah, that guy, I had lunch with him 2 days before he died, or I knew his sister, I went to school with her, or he had a wife and 2 kids, they were 4 and 2, or he and his wife were planning on taking a belated honeymoon when he was killed. So to me, it was a reminder that for those of us who are based in journalism in the Western world, particularly the United States, you know, I like to think as a former editor that the worst thing that could probably happen to me was being sued by a lawyer. But in places like Pakistan, where journalists do nothing short of heroic, courageous work, obviously the stakes are much higher than that.
Well, Hannah, Haley, Ed, and John, I'm easily the most impressive panel I've ever moderated in my life. And I appreciate all of you, what you're doing here at Oklahoma, at the University of Oklahoma. Even though our football team is not winning that much this year, it's great to know that our graduates are winning every day out there. So thank you very much.
You guys are great. Nothing short of